So the next thing we're looking at are budget outcomes and fiscal stances, rather. We're going to start off by looking at the different types of budgets. So what happens, or how do we get to a budget surplus? How do we get to a budget deficit? Or how do we end up in a balanced budget? From there, we're going to look at the fiscal stances. So this is the stance that the government is taking when developing its budget. And that can be to take a contractionary fiscal stance, an expansionary fiscal stance, or a neutral fiscal stance. Within that, we're also going to look at the difference between discretionary fiscal policy as well as non-discretionary fiscal policy. And that's our automatic stabilizers. So let's get into it. So first and foremost, we're going to look at the most simple part, and that is looking at the different types of budget outcomes. Extremely self-explanatory. Just like any normal person's budget, if you spend more than you earn, then you will be in deficit. So in this situation here, we have a budget surplus because revenue is greater than expenditure. We've earned more than we've spent in a certain period of time over the course of the year. In the budget deficit instance, that occurs when our revenue is less than our expenditure. So we've earned less than what we need to spend over the given budget period. A balanced budget occurs when revenue equals expenditure. So since the GFC of 2008-2009, the Australian economy, or the Australian budget rather, has been in budget deficit. And we'll look at the details on that a little bit later on. But when we think back to the last video and our understanding of the current fiscal stance of the Australian government, they are looking at this idea of trying to reach a balanced budget over the medium term through a process of fiscal consolidation, or in other words, reducing their spending. So before we move on to fiscal stances, I wanted to take you quickly through the difference between discretionary fiscal policy and non-discretionary fiscal policy. When we look at the budget, we're really looking at discretionary fiscal policy, or you may see it in your textbook as structural fiscal policy. Discretionary fiscal policy are the deliberate revenue and expenditure changes by the government. So in our budget, they are making very deliberate decisions about how they are going to make their revenue and where they are going to spend those funds. On the other hand, we have what we call non-discretionary or cyclical fiscal policy. Now, non-discretionary, as the term would suggest, are not deliberate changes, but automatic changes to revenue and expenditure. So we call these the automatic stabilizers. And in general, we have two main automatic stabilizers. It is our welfare system as well as our taxation or our progressive tax system. So we'll have a look at that in a little bit more detail later. But the first thing we need to look at are the different discretionary or the deliberate fiscal stances that the government can take. So when developing the budget, the government undertakes one of these discretionary fiscal stances. It might be an expansionary fiscal stance, it might be a contractionary fiscal stance, or it may be a neutral fiscal stance. When taking an expansionary fiscal stance, the government will reduce taxation or increase government expenditure with the goal of, with the result of having a smaller surplus or an increased deficit. The aim of this is to increase economic activity by stimulating aggregate demand. Now, if you're unsure of what that term means, aggregate demand, it's simply the sum of all demand in the economy. So the idea here is that if they can reduce taxation, so they're going to reduce their spending, or they can increase government expenditure, so they can get more funds coming into the government, or a combination of both, to be honest, this will result in smaller surplus or increased deficit, with the aim here of increasing economic activity by stimulating aggregate demand. So we can see that if you reduce taxation, people have more funds available to them, so they will spend more. And also if you increase government expenditure, that's also going to increase economic activity in the broader economy. So we can see how this would lead to a smaller surplus or an increased deficit, particularly due to this idea of increased government expenditure. On the other side of the table, we have a contractionary fiscal stance, and this is what the government is currently taking at the moment. So this is where we increase taxation or we reduce government expenditure. The idea here is to we result in an increased surplus or a smaller deficit with the aim of decreasing economic activity by dampening aggregate demand. So we can see at the moment, because we're trying to get to a budget surplus, it's required some very deliberate actions by the government, and most of these have been to do with how they spend their funds. And you will see if you look back to the fiscal strategy outlook from the government, they talk very deliberately about the need to change spending towards productivity-based outcomes. So why a contractionary stance? We've got two pieces of information here, both are linked, but on the left we have the Australian government budget balance, and this is in terms of nominal GDP figures as a percent of nominal GDP, and on the right we have a table with the years and our underlying cash balance. I've put the definition at the bottom there for you of the underlying cash balance. It's a cash measure that shows whether the government has to borrow from financial markets to cover its activities. So really it's a cash amount that is representative of whether or not we are in budget surplus or budget deficit. To make things easy for you, in the table I've highlighted those years in which we are in budget deficit in red, and in green we have the years that we are in budget surplus. So if you look up over the course of 2004 towards 2008, you can see the government does extremely well. The economy is, as a result of the economy doing very well from the mining boom in particular. We get into a budget surplus of $19.8 billion. However, 2008-2009, we see that reverts down to an underlying cash balance of negative $27 billion. And the key reason for this is the fact that the Australian government in the back end of 2008 and early 2009 went on a spending spree. So they undertook a expansionary fiscal stance and by increasing government spending and decreasing taxation in the economy in order to minimise the effects of the global financial crisis in Australia. And you can see the effects have now been felt for a prolonged period of time. So since 2008, we have been in budget deficit. You can see that for a period, the budget deficit decreased, but we're still up around the negative $37.1 billion in our underlying cash balance. If you look on the left, the graph is projecting that by 2021, we'll be back into a budget surplus. And that's a result of the current government's contractionary fiscal stance. So the second part that we needed to look at were the non-discretionary fiscal policies that the government has, and these are what we call automatic stabilizers. So these are built into our economy, they're built into our budget, and occur without any deliberate action from the Australian government. So I've got two situations here. On the left, we're going to have a look at what happens when we see increased economic activity, and then on the right, we'll have a look at what we see when we have decreased economic activity. On the left, let's start with that. So increased economic activity, that means we're seeing GDP growth at an increasing level. So when GDP growth is increasing, we have incomes will increase, and we'll see taxation revenue increasing. So either people are getting higher wage growth, or they are moving to other jobs where they are seeking higher wages as well, and this will result in taxation revenue increasing. We also tend to see a little bit of bracket creep as well as people push into higher tax brackets. At the same time, we're also going to see unemployment decreasing, which also means that taxation revenue will be increasing as well. But as another result of unemployment decreasing is the fact that we'll get less government expenditure on welfare. So far we've seen taxation revenue increasing and government expenditure decreasing. So all of this will have the result of having a smaller deficit or a larger surplus, depending on what situation we're in. In terms of decreased economic activity, we're going to see incomes decreasing, taxation revenue decreasing, unemployment will increase when GDP growth is slowing, increased government expenditure on welfare. As our unemployment rate increases, more people are demanding welfare. And the result of this is that we'll either have a smaller surplus or a larger deficit because our taxation revenue has decreased and our government expenditure has increased. So that's about it for this video. You've looked at a whole range of items here. Now it's up to you to go through your textbook or your workbook and practice putting all of this theory into more practice. Hope this has helped, and I'll see you in class.